Hello, listeners. This is Janine
and Kristen
from Henrico Casa. You are listening to our podcast, Vigilant Voices.
Living life every day.
Hello, listeners. You're going to be so glad that you're listening with us today.
And I'm also equally glad to be involved in this conversation. Kristen, you know I have loved all of our guests to date, but I am very excited because I know that you have known today's guest for years. And so I am really excited to meet her.
Yes. She is amazing. She has just a wealth of knowledge on the subject of children and trauma, but also has so much practical experience working directly with families. She's a licensed clinical social worker and currently provides training, parent coaching, parent support, and case management to adoptive families.
Such important services. And so she most definitely fits our definition of a vigilant voice.
Yep.
Because she knows about the challenges facing children and families and is working to ensure no child faces additional abuse, neglect, or trauma.
Definitely. My husband and I have actually worked with her personally as the recipient of her parent coaching. And what led us to her was that she was adoption competent and most definitely trauma informed, which is more challenging to find than you would think.
Yes.
And we and our kids have benefited so much from working with her and her use of an attachment theory framework. And before we go further, I just want to give a shout out to the Regional Post-Adoption Consortium Services. It's a state-funded program that's free to families living in Virginia. The only requirements are that you have a finalized adoption and an adopted child under 18. So we will tell you more about that and link in the show notes. But beware, these are free services to families in Virginia.
So, Kristen, thank you. It's a fantastic lead in. And so I am very excited to learn more from her today. So, Denise Purgold, welcome to Vigilant Voices.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're excited.
All right. So it sounds like you and Kristen have a nice history through some actual direct work, which is wonderful, but the rest of us don't. So we'd love to learn a little bit more. So why don't you tell us about yourself and what led you to this type of work?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm an LCSW and I have been at UMFS for a little over 21 years now.
Wow, I didn't realize
it was that long.
Yeah, I've been there a little while. And funny kind of story, after grad school, I started working in the hospital environment and really like that. But I always had a passion for working with children and families.
Yeah.
So I was lucky enough to get a job at UMFS, and I was working in the foster care program initially.
Okay.
And I had a number of roles. I was a trainer, a case manager, a supervisor, and then about 5 years into that role, I lost the grant that I was in charge of, which we know that grant-funded services
comes and goes.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
You know, it's they're wonderful, but sometimes we don't get to keep them for very long. So I found myself in a position where I didn't have a job, but I was lucky because the universe, God, and the agency had a plan for me. And we had a post-adoption grant that we had for a number of years, same state-funded program.
Okay.
But it was mostly case management. And they were seeing that there was definitely a need for a clinical component to post-adoption services.
Makes sense.
Because so many families were being connected to services that were either, at the time, not trauma-informed, definitely not adoption competent, providers that didn't really understand attachment-related issues.
Right.
Sure.
And so the type of supports they were getting weren't the right types of supports.
That makes sense.
So I moved into post-adoption services. And I've been there for 15 years. And now I still am very passionate about the work. So I do a lot of work with predominantly parents. And I do quite a bit of training in the community on trauma's impact on the brain, attachment, core adoption issues. So I've got my hands in a lot of different pots.
You
but
do.
I love what I do.
Yeah.
Which is very important. Yes.
We're grateful for the many ways you're teaching all of us. I mean, as a parent, I so valued your coaching. So when you're explaining your skill set, you know, I'm hearing you use the term trauma-informed. What does that mean?
Trauma-informed is kind of a big umbrella term, but in my role, in a really basic way of explaining it, it means realizing that trauma is very widespread, that it's not something just that affects just a small portion of the population. It's difficult sometimes to even find a person nowadays that hasn't been directly or indirectly affected by, by
true.
trauma.
Very true.
So realizing that it's very common in our society, being able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, not only in our clients, but in our colleagues, in ourselves,
Yeah.
and knowing how to respond to that. And doing everything that we can to make individuals' lives better and not actually re-traumatize them by our approaches or our policies or lack of understanding of what trauma is.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And we do a lot of that work here at CASA and then out in the community as well. And so, Denise, maybe you can tell us even a little bit more or dig a little deeper for us, because we're, many of us, like you said, we see it. We know that the individuals that we work with that are in our families, that are in our lives, like have experienced, trauma, or children have. So how does the approach change when working with families where we know there is a history of trauma?
I think it's a great question.
Yeah.
And using a trauma-informed lens, I believe, is part of the key, because we look at things differently. When we're looking through a trauma-informed lens, when I'm working with families, I need to know what happened to them. I need to know about their story. So I am going all the way back. When I meet with a family, like I met with Kristen and her husband, we go all the way back to the beginning. Like, what do you know about this child's early life experience, including in utero, if you know it? And looking at the child's story and figuring out what the impact of that story was on their development, particularly brain development, which translates into behaviors that sometimes can be a little confusing and very difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
And figuring out what the best approach is to address whatever the presenting issues are that the family's facing, focusing on at least assessing trauma and figuring out how to move forward in terms of whatever the goal is.
Yeah, and keeping that like framework in mind a little bit too.
Yeah. And not knowing, I think in so many cases you don't know the full story.
Right.
So then you're
Right.
kind of trying to fill in pieces or make best guesses, and that can be challenging too. I know what was kind of different for me in meeting with you was this idea of parent coaching.
Right.
And I'll be honest, I think we came to you thinking, please solve our problems in our family. Like we're just
Right.
coming to you to get the
This
answers.
is hard. We need help. Yeah.
Yes. And that isn't what works in a trauma-informed environment, and the hard work needs to be done at home with the people who the children maybe feel safe with or who has influence over the children. And so this idea of parent coaching was teaching us to recognize the root of behaviors and teaching us how to handle them in the best way possible at our home when you weren't with us and we were all by ourselves. Tell us why that idea of parent coaching is so effective.
Yeah, parent coaching is the majority of what I do. And the reason is that we know that healing occurs in the context of a relationship.
Yeah.
And our parents are with our children more than anyone. And so they have the best opportunity for providing experiences for that child to develop more felt safety, more secure attachment patterns, and again, to heal. And you can send a child to a therapist even once a week for a couple of hours. And what we know is that, especially for children who have complex developmental trauma, it really affects the way that the brain wires and their perception of themselves, as well as the world. And so we're talking about brain wiring. And it takes lots of repetition of using a new pathway. For example, the pathway that might be laid down in the brain is that caregivers, especially intimate relationships like a mom or a dad, are unsafe because the harm that occurred to them was in the context of relationship.
Right.
Sure.
So what we want is for that child to have a lot of additional experiences where those relationships are safe so we can lay down new pathways in the brain to allow that child to have felt safety in the home environment.
Yeah.
And so we know that parents are the key. Another part of the parent coaching is really parent support. Many parents come into my office. Again, like you mentioned, Kristen, please fix this.
Right.
Please help us fix this. And certainly the goal is for us to help families and children function more effectively and have stronger relationships. But it's, as you know, not quite so easy. So a lot of parents have their own trauma as a result of parenting a child who's experienced trauma. So really supporting parents and helping them understand that it's not really about them, even though it feels like it's about them, especially when their children are pushing back or, making the parent feel like a bad parent, essentially. There's a lot of shame that parents carry around. And so sometimes my job is just holding space for parents and letting them know this is not your fault.
Yeah.
This is common. It's a very common experience, especially in adoption, and that there is hope.
Yeah.
Right.
And I see myself as a partner with parents. I don't have all the answers.
But you're walking with us. It's a process.
Yeah.
I think that's what I've learned from you is it's a process. It's not like, here's why this is happening. Now you can solve it.
Right.
You know, it's not just going to solve quickly. It's healing. It's talking about long-term brain rewiring. And you walk with us through the process, which we appreciate.
Yeah. You know, it is a long-term process. And so many, because we're so behaviorally focused in terms of a lot of our approaches, traditional parenting and a lot of traditional, even therapeutic approaches, which are more cognitive behavioral in nature, just don't work very well with our kids. So it's really figuring out, how is this child's brain operating? How are they responding to the environment? And what can we do about that to make it better?
Sure.
Well, and, we talk a lot about the brain, and I love brain science from this perspective. So, I get a little happy when, when we talk about this. Yes, I can't help it. And so, we have certainly learned at CASA and through our work, within our trauma-informed, community groups and partnerships. And I think I'm hearing it, echoed here as we chat today. But a child's behavior, which can be challenging due to their trauma, isn't always what needs to be addressed. Correct. It's really the need behind it and what happened that's driving that behavior. Is that right? Is that a fair statement?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay.
Part of being trauma-informed, one of the sort of mantras that we use in trauma-informed care is that kids do well if they can, and that we need to ask what happened to this person rather than what's wrong with this person.
Just that slight change.
Yeah.
Right. And behavior is what we see. Behavior is the thing that's so hard, and that's what people come to us to change is please help me stop this from happening. But behavior is communication. And every behavior communicates some need. And if we just focus on behavior, we're just really kicking the can down the road. We're not really addressing the underlying cause of the behavior. And in particular for the population that I work with, adoptive families, again, going back to this concept that a lot of the harm that they received was at the hands of caregivers.
Right.
The behaviors are pretty strongly ingrained, and there's a lot of healing that needs to be done in terms of felt safety. And so things like consequences tend to work against us, which is a really hard sell sometimes for parents.
Because you're like, I can't let this go.
Right.
Or this, they're not going to function as an adult if they keep doing this.
And, which is true. But we really have to take a step back and say, okay, we have a child whose brain did not wire the way that it was supposed to.
Right.
And we have to go back to the beginning and figure out what they missed so we can provide those things. I tell parents all the time, if it's, academic in particular, when they have problems at school, I have to make them do their homework, and we fight about it all the time.
Right.
I would much rather have a child who was emotionally healthy and had good connected relationships and felt safety in relationships, who caught up academically.
Right.
Yeah.
Than a child who had great behavior and did what they were told, but did not have safety in relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really thank you for expanding on that, because what I loved was when you said, behavior is communication, and kids don't always have the words, especially those who have experienced trauma and do have, wiring that's out of whack, out of sync. That's what we see. That's how it's manifested. So I think that's a good reminder that behavior is a form of communication that we need to listen to in its own way.
Yeah. And listening requires that you have addressed your potential trauma or what triggers you so that you can calmly pause and listen to that behavior, which is easier said than done.
It's really hard.
These are good goals.
Yeah.
Yeah. We always say regulation first is always our goal.
Yeah.
Not just for the person or the child that's getting dysregulated, but we have to regulate ourselves to be able to co-regulate. Someone
exactly.
else,
Yeah.
or help
Which
someone.
makes so much sense. So, Denise, CASA, Henrico CASA, and that our vision is for every child to have a safe, healthy home. Like we wish that for every single child in the world, definitely in our county. But what about you? Like if you had to sum up, what is your vision for children? What would it be?
Of course, it's very similar to your vision, but I think boiling it down even a little bit more is for children to have felt safety in their homes and their relationships, because that's what's really missing, and that's what drives so many of the challenges that children and families face.
Yeah.
So fundamental.
And can you explain what it means? Because I didn't know that term until I kind of was going down this road. How would you define felt safety?
It's a good question. I'm glad you asked. Felt safety is how safe a person feels. So often we have children who are in families that are just wonderful and they are safe physically. And the parents are providing what they think is emotional safety, and they probably are. But if the child doesn't feel safe, again, going back to this concept of their brain being wired to not let a mom get close to them because that's very scary in so many ways. If their brain is wired in that way, then that makes it really, really difficult for them to feel safe.
Sure.
So I always tell parents, of course, it matters whether they're actually safe or not.
Right.
But what's more important is, do they feel safe? And this can take a really, really long time.
To rebuild that.
And that's where the hard work comes in for parents, because it's like, oh my gosh, it's like Groundhog's Day,
right,
over and over and over again. How many times do we have to have the same conversation or say this thing? And my answer is always, as long as it takes.
You got to keep on keeping on, right?
Yeah.
No. Well, Denise, we are starting to come to the end of our time together. But thank you so much for joining us and being a vigilant voice for children. We like to end each episode with some sort of call to action just for our listeners. You know that most of our listeners likely aren't foster parents or adoptive parents, but they're listening because they have a heart for children and families. They have children and families. So what would be your call to action that our listeners or that all of us can do to best support children in our community?
That's a really good question and a big one. I think if I had to pick one thing, I would say to become trauma informed.
Yeah.
Love that.
To attend a training. There's lots of books out there to understand how widespread it is and what it looks like and how you can help, because I think that is one of the keys.
Yeah.
If we could all understand trauma a little bit better and move towards healing rather than focusing on changing behavior and punishment and all of those things, I think our communities would be a lot healthier and maybe healing would happen a little faster.
Yeah. That's a great call to action. And I'm going to put you on the spot and ask, I was going to, in our notes, give people links to your contact information, to the post-adoption services that are state funded, but would you be willing to share with us some of your favorite trauma-informed resources? And I can link to that as well.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So we'll get those from Denise. We'll post them in the show notes. And anything else you want to share before we wrap things up?
got to do one more plug because for adoption
Go for it.
and adoptive families, an add-on to the question that you just asked, for people who are working with adopted families, another thing that I think is really important is to understand a little bit about core adoption issues that adoptive families face as well as attachment, because that's such a crucial thing in working with this population. And there are a lot of resources out there for that as well.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that I do a lot of training. If individuals are working with adopted families, we do some community training as long as we can connect it to a family that is enrolled in our program.
Sure, that makes sense.
So if there are organizations that work with adopted families, as long as we can get one family enrolled in our program, we can do trainings on trauma and attachment and adoption and those kinds of things. So they're out there.
Amazing. Yeah. I know that you helped kind of coach one of my children's counselors because you were able to provide that education. So that's amazing. Awesome. Well, we just appreciate you so much. Again, a wealth of knowledge. We'll probably have you on again one day because there's so much you could say.
So much to keep talking about. Yeah.
I would be happy to come.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to Vigilant Voices, Henrico Casa's new podcast. We have a vision for all children to live in safe, healthy homes. You can help us make that happen. Tell a friend about our podcast and find us on social media.
I believe in the better days.